All right. Again, in some video experimentation and also in an effort to free up a little time, let's talk about why study history. I'm Professor Eric Martin, and this is Lewis Clark State College. Oh, look at that. Why study history? I think that we have to really justify any topic that we're spending time on. And the Peter Stearns piece that you may have read, so this is a 1998 piece from the American Historical Association entitled Why Study History. I love that piece. He is a lucid historian, and the points he brings up are straightforward. So let's just go through a couple of them. The idea about studying history, because history helps us to understand people and societies. And I got some notes here I'm using. The short version of this is history is really only the only existential evidence base. It's the only data set we really have for understanding how societies function, and people need to understand how their societies operate. And in order to understand how our societies operate now, how people have related to each other, we need to think about how that works in the past. So it's working in some ways with the only evidence we really have. History also helps us understand change and how the society we live in came to be. And many people see this as one of the primary reasons for understanding history. The past and the present and the future, the three worlds, right, are all intricately connected and, influence one influence one another. One take, I'm just moving through it. So again, history is really the only extensive set of data, set of materials to study the issues of social change, to study the issues of how we got to where we're at. Also, history is important. I'm going to leave the camera here. I'll fix it next time, huh? The importance of history in our own lives. This is one of the primary reasons people get interested in history, is that it makes them as a person kind of feel connected to the rest of the world. There's a reason that biography is one of the most popular forms of history. Sort of me connecting with another person, and it helps us create different kinds of meanings, for our own life. So seeing how meaning was constructed in the past, seeing how meaning has been constructed for other people, it helps us do it too. Moral understanding. History can provide good terrain for moral contemplation. What is right? What is wrong? Studying the stories of individuals or situations in the past, this used to be an important aspect of why we looked at history. Also, history, and it still is, also history providing identity, not only for individuals, but also for peoples, okay? And pick your group of people. And this issue of the convergence of history and identity is also one of the areas where, for better or for worse, history gets intersected with politics, right? Because whenever you get into issues of identity politics, history is being used and misused in an effort to bolster someone's argument about who we as a people are, what we as a people have done, what we as a people deserve, whatever, however you want to put it. And then you got this part here about studying history being essential for good citizenship. And this goes back to sort of the Jeffersonian idea, right? That in order to maintain a functional democracy, people need to know how it works. And the way that you learn how it works is by looking at history, looking at the emergence of national institutions, looking at the emergence of various problems that have had. Um, and this is, one of the ways we can, look at history, whether that's American history or any other kind of history. So these are good reasons to study history. But there's other good reasons to study history. There are skills that students of history develop, and habits of mind is one way to think about them. The ability to assess evidence, and that's what we're doing with the Worlds of History book, right? Assessing evidence. I'm reading these documents, and how do I determine what I'm supposed to get out of the document? How do I read between the lines? How do I know this document saying what I think it says? So the ability to work with that. But then also with the ability to work with this idea that, well, I read one document that told me one thing happened, and I read this other document that told me something else happened. Well, what am I supposed to do? So it gives us some experience in terms of assessing conflicting interpretations, because not only primary sources conflict. You can just think about this in the old analogy, right, about eyewitnesses. And the eyewitnesses see the car crash, and how many of those eyewitnesses actually saw the same thing. Well, this is the issue about conflicting interpretations. Then the other thing that it helps us to sort out is it gives us some experience in assessing past examples of change. Change has occurred over time. How do we look to see what those impacts have been? How do we document that so we know that we're talking about something real? How do we set this up in some way so that we can talk about it, more sophisticated? And these are the kinds of skills that employers are interested in. Not necessarily focused, on historical content, but I can assess evidence. I can deal with conflicting interpretations in the evidence. I can operate with how changes occurred in the past. Yeah, we think we can use you as a grant writer for this particular project or whatever it is. So there's a whole skill set that I also think you should not underestimate that you're picking up in this class. Now, the term history parades under at least 3 different versions, and it's important for you to understand which version you're working with. On the one hand, there's history as storytelling. And that's probably what gets a lot of us interested in history to begin with. Oh, my grandfather could tell some good stories. And those stories were about my ancestors, his father, his grandfather, his brothers and sisters, people that, I may have known, may not have known, and told some really, really great stories. Whether they were true or not is a different thing, right? So history is storytelling. On the one hand, you want to use the narrative device in order to keep your audience engaged. And on the other hand, you can't alter the tale in order to keep them engaged. So you got to watch out for that. History is moral example. So frequently history being utilized to convey some kind of sense of morality. Now, we already talked about that just a second ago in the terms of this is one of the reasons that some people like to look at history to try to get a sense of right and wrong. But I'll give you an example of history as moral example. Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography, My Experiments in Truth. Don't let the big, thick book scare you off. It's a fun book. It's a fun book. But he makes it very clear that his autobiography is intended to send a moral message. and whether or not it's true or not is a different story, right? So, got to be careful for that. And you have to know how to look out for it. The other form of history is history as analysis. That's what we're going to engage in for the most part in this class. History, not so much as does it tell a great story. History, not so much as does it provide us moral guidance. Maybe it does. But history as how do we figure out what happened? That's what we're going to do. So you can think about yourselves a little bit like lawyers in this class. We're lawyers trying to make the argument to the judge, this is what we think happened. Or at least this is as much as we can prove happened. And then after that, it's conjecture. Now, why study history is different than what is history, right? And so let me go through a few bits with what is history. History is all the things, I've got to get through my notes here, all the things we've talked about. But if you want Professor Martin's straight up short version definition of history, here it is. It's the study of change over time. And chronology is just a fancy word for time. Study of change over time. That is what you're doing in your papers for this class. You are demonstrating change over time. Or maybe you're demonstrating things have stayed the same over time. But the key component to history is time, right? We're time lords. We work with time. And there's some tricks to it. And I'll show you some of those tricks. Now, the thing is, in order to work with time, you got to be able to talk about time. So, historians use a few different dating systems. I'm sure you're familiar with BC, AD, BCE, CE. Most of y'all are probably operating with BCE and CE. They are exactly the same as BC and AD. It's focusing around the year 0. I'm old enough to have come up under both systems. I use them interchangeably. It's not a good habit. It's a habit that I have. We also talk about millenniums, all right, 1,000 years. The first millennium, so that's year 0 to year 999. The second millennium, that's year 1000 to year 1099. But when historians talk about the fourth millennium, they're not talking about the future. They're assuming we all understand that's fourth millennium BC. And then they also talk about centuries, 14th, 15th, 16th century. Keep in mind that the centuries are always a year ahead of the numbers, right? We are in 2020 as of this video recording, but we are in the 21st century. It's easy, you guys. That's not news. History is based on evidence, all right? It's based on secondary source data. It's based on primary source data. And the evidence for this class is coming out of this book. Let's talk about a couple of forms of evidence. Primary sources. And one of the things I want you to be able to quickly identify starting next week is when you're reading the material in this book, is the source a primary source or a secondary source? A primary source is direct evidence. It is material created during the period that we're studying. It is an eyewitness account. All right, that is a primary source. History is based on evidence. It is based on sources. So as far as this class goes, you're going to be allowed to make, I'm going to give you a wide latitude in the kinds of arguments that you can make. But all those arguments will be based on evidence. All right? Primary sources. But history is also based on informed interpretation and analysis. All right? And the evidence, the primary source evidence, doesn't always speak for itself. Sometimes you need a way to understand that or to contextualize it. And that is usually what we describe as secondary sources. And the secondary sources are the things that people like me, historians, write. Historical interpretations and analysis about the time under study based on the evidence, right? And in order to study any historical topic, you have to be able to identify what the primary sources are, you have to be able to identify what the secondary sources are, and you have to be able to work with both styles of sources because you're going to need them. Now, there is an additional style of source, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, known as a tertiary source, synthetic interpretations. Basically, we're talking about encyclopedias here. You're typically not, this is a standard history textbook. It's, oh, ouch. It's information that might be new to you, but to historians, this is stuff everybody knows. So you don't necessarily have to use that. Tertiary sources are really good places to go to get started on a topic, and they can start leading you places. I don't really think there's any of them in here. History is also based on methodology and on theory. How a primary source is interpreted or viewed frequently depends on the method utilized to understand the source. For example, insurance records of 18th century slave traders would be of interest both to an economic historian who was trying to figure out how profitable a particular portion of the slave trade was, but it would also be interesting to a cultural historian who was attempting to document which portions of Africa slaves were taken out of at certain times and what portions of the Americas, for example, they arrive at. So these two different historians, the economic historian and the cultural historian, have got two different questions. And they're asking the source different questions. And so that source is providing them different answers depending on the method that they're using. Don't make it any more complicated than it needs to be. When we're talking about a method, we're just talking about, you can read your source and see what it tells you. But if you read the source with a question in mind, what does this source tell me about the role of women in this particular society? Then it might tell you something different. All right, so that's method. And we'll come back to that, but at its most basic level, it's being conscious of the approach you use to interpret the sources or the data. And we'll come back to stuff about theory later, but there's historical theory involved in what we do. Historical interpretation is also informed by related disciplines. Historians are frequently familiar with anthropology, economics, political science, sociology, some of them literature, some of them psychology, some of them archaeology, languages. You can see how you can have history as a field and you can have a lot of interrelated subfields on it. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's a reading sport. History is a reading sport. History is often contested ground or a matter of perspective. And that doesn't mean to say that we can't figure out what happened, but it does mean to say sometimes it's trickier than you would think. Let me give you a couple of examples. From time to time, what we know or what we think we know about the past changes as we learn more. I mean, that's just like what happens in the natural sciences. I'm not attempting to argue that history is, just like the natural sciences. But every few months or so, it seems like the New York Times science page has some story announcing that there's these new discoveries in the field of cosmology. And it's really altered the way we think we should, conceptualize what's going on in the universe. This dark matter stuff, there's a whole lot more of it than we thought there was. We don't think it's as empty as we did before. We just think we can't see it. And the reaction to that frequently is, hooray, knowledge has been expanded. But you do that with history. Well, what we used to think about, this particular historical event is not true. And then people like, boo, boo, we liked it the way it was. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. There are still written languages we're not able to read. There's still archaeological sites we haven't found. Those are the easy ones. But there's other issues that have never been settled because they were political to begin with. And untangling all that, you have to get away from it. That's sort of the key. That's why time is the key. Historians like to be away from it to have perspective. It's hard to have perspective on a hot topic. But when we learn more about the past, we need to update our perceptions of what happened. So that's the issue of how history changes. Additionally, even when historians agree upon the evidence, they don't always agree on what it means. And not every historian has access to the same sets of evidence, right? Well, how could that be? How many languages can you read? How many languages is it expected for any individual to be able to read? So we can just start with that. Therefore, you're going to run into different interpretations of almost anything you run into. Interesting technical issue there. Let's see if I resolved it. And then there's this whole matter of perspective. And the past can appear different depending on who you are. Different people have different versions of history. And this is easy to see by looking at the 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. Some people view him as a rather important president because the territory of the United States expanded greatly under his administration. Others aren't so sure he was that great. He was a major instigator of the Indian Wars, and that is how the territory expanded. Others see him as a large slaveholder and supporting a slave system. So we could continue to play with this, but the whole point is sometimes this stuff is a matter of perspective, especially when you get into the issue of greats, right? And we're going to try to avoid that. But it inevitably comes up. But the big point, though, is that we need to develop the ability to see history from more than one point of view. We need to develop the ability to see issues from more than one point of view. And if the study of history has anything of value to teach, it's the importance to seeing multiple sides of to any question as we seek to kind of figure out how it works. In this class, I'm presenting my interpretation based on the evidence I've seen. Each of our readings is going to provide a different interpretation. I do not expect all of you to have the same view as me concerning the readings. In fact, this will be a very boring class if we all agree. It'll be more interesting if we have disagreements about how we understand the past. And when this happens, speak up. Demonstrate your points with evidence and do it in a friendly, civilized manner. And this class will be great. All right. History is also relevant to our daily lives. And I know I got to figure out how to float that bad boy back on top. There we go. Demonstrate your historical points with evidence and history related to our daily lives. Although some historians claim to study the past purely for the pleasure of the beauty of the past, I've always been so skeptical of that. I believe, and I don't mean to be too dramatic about it, but I believe that having an understanding of history is literally a matter of life or death. Because if you do not know some history, if you do not have an understanding of how to operate with the data set that tells us what the human experience has been like, then it literally is like you were born yesterday. And you have no choice but to accept what people tell you as true. I've just never been that kind of person. And whenever I see somebody in a position of power tell us history tells us or history demonstrates, red flags go off for me. Oh, really? I'd like to hear this. And then I want to check it out myself and see. Sometimes it turns out. But I think there is a connection between power and the past. And I think it's important for us to have an understanding of history as a way of understanding how power is explained. What else we got here? History is a way of thinking and learning. I've already talked about that. I won't drag us down that path. I will drag us down a few other paths before we go, though. A couple of things. It might be useful for you all to have some ideas, some different types of history. This list is not intended to be exhaustive. Political history, that's probably what you're familiar with. The history of states, the history of nations, the history of kingdoms, the history of empires. But there's also economic history, distribution of resources, intellectual history, that's sort of my original field. History of ideas, where do these ideas come from? Social history, the history of regular people. The idea that women might have a different fundamental human experience than men, or that maybe the children of miners in the Silver Valley up in the Coeur d'Alenes might have a fundamentally different historical experience than the children of, New York City bankers or whatever. So the history of regular people. And that's a little trickier history, right? Because regular people are at work. And so they're not necessarily creating historical resources for us to look at. But if you can identify different types of history, when you're reading, what kind of type of history might this be? It'll help you think about things. And it also might help you find some types of history you're interested in, right? There's all kinds of types of history. There's a few different ways to organize history too. We can organize it by eras. Medieval history, 1776, the 20th century. That's easy. We can organize it by topics. The history of science, the history of women, the history of the military. can organize it by geography, Lewiston, China, the Indian Ocean, by events, the history of the French Revolution, or we can do problems. Why are some countries so rich and others so poor? Has racism always existed? Do women deserve a more prominent role in history courses? So there's not one that's better than the other. I would like for you to practice recognizing how history is organized when you read it, and I would like for you to practice being cognizant of the way you are organizing history when you present it. It's easy enough. And then finally, you guys are going to hear me use this metaphor over and over and over. I'd like for you to think about history as data. Because if you can think about this class as you're learning how to work with data, and it just happens to be historical data, then it might be easier for you to apply it to your major or your job or your other classes, which you are also being asked to work with data. You are being asked to collect data. You're being asked to describe the data. You're being asked to analyze the data. You're being asked to compare the data. You are being asked to organize the data. You're being asked to interpret the data, and you're being asked to present the data orally and in written form. And if we can think about that as sort of the thing we're really doing in this class, the thing we're really using this book for, data analysis, then maybe it's not so hard to make the jump between history and your other classes. That's all I got to say on that. If you guys have questions, we'll deal with them in class. Thank you.